Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here in City Council chambers for this hearing on Small and Minority Business Committee. I'll formally call the committee to order. We're here tonight to review the findings of the 2019 Columbus Disparity Study. The Office of Diversity and Inclusion commissioned Mason Tillman in January of 2017 to conduct a disparity study. The goal of this study was to determine whether minority and women-owned businesses have had equal access to the city's contracting opportunities. The critical part to understand is that the disparity study forms a legal foundation for future policy changes aimed at ensuring equitable contracting. We're going to take a hard look at the problem tonight. We're not going to determine the precise solutions at this hearing, but look forward to working with the department and all those members of the community here tonight to craft solutions to eliminate these disparities. Council's next step is to accept or reject these findings at our next legislative meeting this upcoming Monday, July 29th. Again, this is accepting these numbers as our legal foundation, not implementing any changes to our procurement process at this time. We'll first begin by hearing a presentation from the Director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, Ms. Demita Brown, and representatives from Mason Tillman. And we will have council members will be able to ask any questions as we move through the hearing and can jump in at any time. Certainly want to recognize my colleague, Councilmember Favor. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for all your hard work. Councilmember, do you have any opening comments? All right. At this point, we'll jump right in. I'll turn the microphone over to Director Brown and Mason Tillman.
Thank you, Council President Hardin and Councilmember Favor, for the opportunity to share the results of our hard work over the last couple of years to ensure that we create that legal foundation to support the growth and development of our minority and women-owned businesses here in Columbus, Ohio. I will allow Dr. Ramsey from Mason Tillman to begin to go through the slides, talk a little bit about that legal foundation and the background for that, as well as the data. And then we'll go right into some of the next steps, and we'll open it up for questions if that's okay with you. Thank you. Dr. Ramsey.
Oh, I think it helps, huh? Little things. Good evening, President Hardin and Councilwoman Favor. It's my pleasure to be here, and let me see if I can make this move for a starter. Is it on? Is it? We had a check a minute ago, but something, it's an operator error. Okay, still the right one. All right, thank you. So my presence today is to give you just an overview of the team that conducted the study, and to talk just a bit about the purpose and the process of the study, and then to present to you the statistical findings, which is the reason for performing the study. And we've also made some recommendations and have some suggestions for what you might do upon the acceptance of the study. So by virtue of the profile, it is important to know that we're an organization that has been conducting this work now for several decades, and so we bring to you extensive experience, and having done work in cities around the country, several right here in the state of Ohio, as well as states, counties, transportation agencies, and special districts like utility transportation districts. Our municipal studies span the full continent, and noting too that we've done studies in Dayton and in Cincinnati, and in Cleveland within the state of Ohio. And we've done very large studies like the city of New York. So this study brought its challenges, but we brought to it the experience that was necessary to complete the work. And we worked with a local team, which for us was important because it left within this community the intellectual property that you need to go forward with future work in this area. So to speak to the purpose of the study, our study is guided by a decision that the U.S. Supreme Court made on issued on the 23rd of January, 1989. And at that point, the U.S. Supreme Court defined a different standard for establishing programs that attended and intended to provide access to, to contracting by minority businesses. I might note the court did not address woman-owned business, so the standard for woman-owned business participation goals is different as it is for small, local, and other groups of businesses that you might have an interest in extending access to your contracts. But for minority businesses, the standard that the court established was that you had to have a compelling interest in order to have a program, and that interest had to be based on evidence of systemic statistical disparity. And what we have done over these months is to assess whether you had a disparity in the use of available businesses. And any remedy, according to the court in that decision in 1989, has to be narrowly tailored to those ethnic groups that have a statistically significant disparity. And you must update your program that's based on those findings periodically. The notion is that if you put in place race-based remedies, it will alleviate, correct, and address any identified disparity. So with time, you should go back and check the effectiveness of your program. And so the disparity study objectives are to determine if, one, is a statistical disparity exists in the use of available minority businesses, and to ascertain practices which might affect any documented disparity, and therefore assess the effectiveness of race and neutral programs. And the city has been operating a small business program which is considered race neutral, and one would want to, the objective, no doubt, in putting that program in place was that it was going to correct any disparities, and so we had to assess whether that in fact occurred. And then to provide detailed program recommendations that would be intended to address those disparities, and to prepare a report with narrowly tailored findings for any ethnic groups that had a disparity. So narrowly tailoring is a basic principle in the law that needs to be kept in mind as we look at what the study has presented, because under the narrowly tailored principle, goals, if you put them in place, would have to be based on those groups that had a race disparity. Gender has a lower standard. It needs only to have the underutilization of women. But race, it must be statistically significant underutilization. And therefore, the goals based on those findings must be limited to the groups that have a disparity. And the level of goals that you might place on your subcontracts would also be defined. The maximum level would be the level of availability of that group within the whole. So those are our standards with which we are operating. So then to look at the statistical findings, which are the core of this endeavor, we did a study that covered the period January contracts awarded from January 1, 2012 until December 31st, 2015. And within that examination, we were looking at your construction contracts, professional service contracts, and goods and service contracts. So that's the study period. And the process that we used was we had to receive from you your prime contracts, and the city auditor provided us with prime contracts awarded and payments. We were also able to get some subcontracts directly from the city's data that was provided electronically. So we had a selected number of subcontracts that we were able to receive that way. But additionally, we had to do other work in order to secure as complete a set of subcontracts as possible. And I might note, because there is not a comprehensive recording, capturing of subcontracts in the process of either awarding your contracts or in the duration of those contracts, it is a reconstruction. And there is not an absolute number of contracts to be collected because we don't know what the actual number of subcontracts were. So there was an extensive effort to reconstruct those subcontracts, and that was done in part by actually going into the departments and collecting subcontract records that were known to the departments. And in some cases, they had some records which they provided, and in other instances, we actually pulled project files to review them. And we surveyed the prime contracts to ask them if they would assist us by giving us the names of their subcontractors. And then when we compiled this data, to the extent that we were able to reconstruct it, given the constraints of having a situation where there were not a defined set of contracts, as was the case with prime contracts, we then surveyed the subs to ask, one, did you get the award that the city has reported or that the prime has reported, and what were you actually paid? So that work was rather arduous in order to try to do as complete as possible reconstruction. And then on the other side of this analysis is what the court refers to as ready, willing, and able. And it is necessary for the city to use contractors that are ready, willing, and able. And if indeed you do that without any barriers to the process, the court said that you will be using those companies at the same level that they are present in your market area. So to define businesses ready, willing, and able, we collected first the city's successful prime contractors and the subcontractors. And then from there, we looked at certification directories maintained by various organizations within the market area. And we went to advocacy groups to ask them for their business memberships, to trade associations and professional associations. We did Chamber of Commerce, both ethnic chambers as well as the main traditional Chamber of Commerce. And then we did several business community meetings in which there was extensive outreach in an effort to try to ensure that all businesses in the market area, and I might note that the city's parameters were, a jurisdiction was defined as the market area, all businesses willing and able to do business with the city, we feel confident that we were able to identify if they wish to be known. And I might note, when we compiled information from the trade association chamber directories, we had to affirm that those listed businesses were really willing to do the city's work. We could not presume. We certainly presumed any business that had received certification, since you have to give your firstborn to get certified as a minority business enterprise, we assumed those businesses were indeed willing. But all others, we had to establish that they were willing. So it's a very arduous task, and a task that we feel, very positive results, in that we're comfortable that we have a comprehensive list of businesses that are available to do your business. And then we had to establish and define and determine the ethnicity and gender of each of those identified businesses. So to get to a place where we were actually able to conduct our statistical analysis, we have spent a fair amount of time, I might note from June 2017 to July 2019, getting to this point. But I trust that the level of effort that was expended to get here, that all parties within the city and in your community are confident that this information is comprehensive and reliable. But we began when we received from the city auditors a record, electronic records of the contracts that had been awarded and captured in their system. And from that, we proceeded within several months of receiving that to clean that data and to classify each of those records into one of the three industries that we studied. And that classification, the comprehensiveness of the data, was approved by the city. And with that, we proceeded then to do the analysis, to collect the identified, to collect the available businesses in your market area, to prepare a description of your procurement process, and to reconstruct your subcontractor records. So we spent a number of months doing that and got ourselves to March 2018 when we submitted a draft report. And upon submitting of the draft report, it was determined by some of the department heads that they felt that the data that the auditor had provided was not complete. And many months was spent with those departments reviewing the data that had been approved months earlier and looking at their records. And from that, it was determined that there were some federally funded contracts that the departments had that did not find their way into the auditor's data set in a fashion that it was retrievable. And so they provided those records to us. And they also felt that there's some classifications of contracts into industries that they did not agree with. And so we had numerous meetings directly with the department heads to discuss what records they felt contracts should be reclassified, and some we agreed with, some we did not. And I think after those months of discussion, there was a consensus that the data that we were going to analyze was complete, included the federal contracts that the auditor did not have readily available to retrieve. And we had then proceeded, and in June 2019, we resubmitted a draft which revised to reflect those new contracts and reclassification. I might note that the entire data set changed less than 0.5%, but it did at least accommodate the concerns and questions that the departments have. And so here we are in July with a final report and an executive summary, which we have submitted, and I'm sure has been read by most, if not all. And for those who haven't read it, I would encourage them to do so. So we have this time period, 2012 to 2015, and I think it's important to note that, and I had noted earlier that the city was the market area, when in fact I misspoke. It is really the county that's the market area. And it's within the county that basically 75% of all your dollars were spent. And that was a significant number of dollars to be spent in the court. It's not very explicit as to what constitutes a market area, but clearly it can be your jurisdictional boundaries, it can be where you're spending your dollars. What it cannot be is where you do not spend your dollars. And so we're very comfortable with the market area as has been defined, and hopefully you will find it doable for you as well. It is important to note that you spent a lot of dollars, $1.7 billion during that time period. And within those dollars, you purchased, you awarded roughly 21,000 contracts. Construction, about 1,000, professional service, about 2,500. And everything else was spent on goods and services. And that's not an unusual spread of dollars. And in turn, on our subcontracts, we were able to identify roughly 1,200 subcontracts for those, both between construction and professional services. And I would like really to thank all city staff that worked with us, as well as the community, in this effort to reconstruct data that was difficult to secure because it was not readily available. And clearly, one of our recommendations going forward is that you capture it at the time a contract is awarded and then track it throughout the life of the contract. So when you do an update, there will be no issue as to what contracts were awarded to subcontractors during the life of any given time period. But so were able to do that. We also looked at your contracts, but at what we would define, and I think you define as formal and informal. Informal being the level of contracting where advertising is limited, if at all. Formal is where you have to have a publication of your contracts. But what we did in looking at your formal contracts and recognition that the court has asked to have consideration given to both willing and able businesses, we have put a threshold, a limit on the size of the prime contracts that we examine. And so we've excluded the large contracts, which we define as outliers. We think it's a more accurate picture of utilization given the range of capacity, and we've done a number of things as described in our availability chapter to define the capacity within the business community. But we think that with our experience, based on the way the business community is structured, The very large contracts are really the domain of very few contractors, regardless to race or gender. And so having a limit placed on the size of contracts analyzed, we think is prudent, we think it's effective, and so our findings as reported for formal contracts, those which were to be competitively bid, reflect those parameters. And you'll see on construction, it's 1.5 million, and on professional service, it's 420, and on goods and services, it's 180, and so $1,000. So as we report out disparity, it's disparity on contracts at that level, at the prime, and I think it's a very important point to keep in mind. We're not talking goods and services about very large contracts, and you will see that there is disparity even when contracts are small. And on the informal level, we followed your standards of 100,000 and under for construction, 50 and under for professional services, and 20,000 and under for goods and services. And again, even at those thresholds, we have disparity. So the other question is, who is in the marketplace? Who's in Franklin County willing and able to do your business? And so what you see here is the percent of the total contractors by ethnicity and gender. And so you have a significant presence of contractors, female-owned, Caucasian female, and African-American contractors in your market area. And in some industries, professional service in particular, you have a significant number of Asian Americans as well. But those are the people in the market area in Franklin County who are willing and able to do your business. And it is that number that we used when we did our analysis of your use of contractors. And this, yes, okay. This slide illustrates the highly used prime contractors. And this particular approach to looking at your data we think is instructive to let you know how many contractors got most of your dollars. And you will see in construction that you had 15 vendors who received almost 70% of your dollars, and it reflected 23 in professional services, that very few vendors are getting most of your awards. And that's something to think about when you look at the composition of your business community as to what's willing and able. And this slide illustrates that point again, where the percent of all prime contract dollars, the blue represents the availability, and the red, the use. And so you see that non-minority males secured the majority of your contract dollars, although they did not represent the majority of your available businesses. And so that evidence itself in the subcontracting arena as well, that the majority of the dollars are going to Caucasian males, albeit, or non-minority males, albeit they did not represent the majority of the available businesses. And so again, when we looked at the disparity, which you can see projected here, we are looking at a disparity at these levels where the outliers, the very large contracts, have been removed. And we make a distinction here with women between disparity and underutilization, because women are not subject to the strict scrutiny standard, which says there must be a statistically significant underutilization for there to be a remedy applied. So women simply have to have fewer contracts than their availability. And you will see in some cases women actually have a statistically significant disparity, but in others they are simply underutilized. And then there's some groups that are underutilized, but you can't test it at all because there are just too few available businesses. So we portrayed it for you in various ways so you can see both by industry and by gender and ethnicity what the disparity was as reflected in the use of available businesses. And goods and services, you see a similar pattern of the groups that have, across the industries, a disparity. Subcontractor utilization, we looked at it as well, and you can again see where there is a disparity in the use of subcontractors in construction and in professional services, where you have disparity as reflected in the use of the different ethnic groups at the subcontractor level. These are decisions that the prime made in determining who would be used to, for the dollars on the contracts that were funded by the City of Columbus. The third leg of a disparity study is the anecdotal. The court says it's important to know how businesses perceive doing business with a governmental entity. The anecdotal is also very instructive in giving you ideas as to how you might make changes in the way you provide your opportunities to your constituents. And so we interviewed businesses, and I might thank the business community for affording us an opportunity to have those interviews, because once you lay your soul before an unknown entity, you never know where it might end up. And so for businesses to feel that this was an important enough matter to actually be candid with us about their experiences, I thank them and commend them for doing so. So from that analysis, we were able to cull some patterns in terms of barriers that are attributed to the City of Columbus. And businesses describe bid information being difficult to obtain, that prime contracts are bundled, and clearly you have contracts which you bid one agreement and there are multiple contracts that are issued against that agreement. The various departments can use it over time. Therefore, those dollars are all under the control of one contractor for many years and for a considerable amount of the work that you do, both at the professional service level and the construction level and goods and services. So that's one area that I think needs very serious consideration. And just extending contracts, one contract with multiple renewals over time, does close out businesses. And more importantly, it means that a company that is able to work with you for 3 consecutive years is going to be in a better position to bid if you open it up for another 3 years, because they've forged relationships. And much of contracting is relationships, even if it is low bid. Low bids sometimes are bid low, and then amendments and change orders, if you're comfortable, get added to a contract, and you are able to recoup the money that the next highest bidder submitted. So it's something to be examined very closely. You also have, during the course of the study period, you introduced the council-approved policy for pre-qualification. Your pre-qualification application is about 35 pages, and my experience is it is the most arduous pre-qualification that I've seen in the 20 years that I've been doing this work, even to the extent that you're asking companies to define their retirement plans, to retire their health plans, what their bonding levels are, and you're requiring the contractor to be pre-qualified to submit a bid and the subs to be pre-qualified to submit a bid. And no doubt the findings that we have found in this analysis may be driven by the fact that if you're not pre-qualified, you can't even submit a bid. And that's for large contracts, small contracts. So I think that that's another example of things that have been defined, practices that have been defined by the business community as barriers. Also, lead time to submit a bid is a question, and monitoring, which may be seen as disparate, that some contractors get monitored more heavily than others. Sometimes the inspector tells some contractor you've laid your a trench in the wrong place before the trench is covered, and sometimes they wait until you fill it and then tell you it's laid in the wrong place. So those are issues that have come to our attention through those interviews. And then payment by to the prime contractors, which is sort of different, as you will, as opposed to a formal practice of paying people for an approved invoice in a timely fashion. And then the absence of standardized procurement process with a written procurement policy leads to differential treatment and leads to arbitrary decisions. And so all of which were identified by the business community. Also, the business community identified barriers that they feel are attributed to prime contractors. When bids are shopped after an award, prime receives an award and now decides that maybe the bid that they did accept from a minority or a woman they think should be reduced a little, and now that they have a bird in a hand, they feel that they can ask and demand of the subcontractor that they lower their bid, and one has to decide, what decisions do you make? A scope of work might be reduced after the prime has been awarded the contract, and the sub has to accept less than what they thought they were going to get and that they bid on. And then substitutions where the sub is simply not used and with no repercussions for that. And then the performance standards, again, disparate treatment that is accorded some contractors based on race and gender, is decisions that prime makes and how they deal with them. And in one expression of that is whether they pay the sub properly and timely, and also whether the change orders that the city may approve, whether that trickles down to the sub who actually perform the extra work required by the change order. So those are some of the perceptions of the business community and matters that we have reflected in our recommendations to try to convey to you some of the enhancements that we feel might be helpful, and also to bring you some best management practices from around the nation. So one of the things that we think should be considered is the supplier diversity program enhancements, and you need to formalize the supplier diversity policies, procedures, and you also need to staff the office so that the work of the diversity manager, director can be carried out in the fashion that's consistent with good public policy. And technical assistance is important to provide to businesses in a systematic way. And you have so many partners in your community with whom this work can be done in concert that I think that you could have a very progressive technical assistance program for businesses where you offered real training and real opportunities to enhance and improve, and in hand in glove with managers responding and managing their prime and subcontractors in a way that's supportive of attaining a successful outcome in a contract and a profitable outcome. The outreach program, we believe, based on the anecdotal and the statistical findings, could be expanded. And also your certification and vendor registration program could be enhanced. And we really think that you need to implement compliance standards. You need to hold your prime contractors and your managers to those standards so that you do indeed know who is going to be used as proposed in a bid or a proposal and who in fact gets used on those contracts. And then a mentor-protege program is a very good technique as well as encouraging joint ventures between MWBEs to build increased capacity and access to your contracts. And a business advisory council, we think, provides excellent oversight and help and insight as you move forward in doing things in a different manner. And so your race-conscious remedies, we think you should apply bid discounts on construction, professional service contracts, and any goods and services contracts where there is a low bid provision in the solicitation. And also for those contracts that are awarded based on qualifications and evaluation, we think that there should be evaluation points that are assigned to those businesses that had a disparity in an effort to offset the conditions that led to the disparity. And then we think you should set subcontract goals on construction and professional service contracts consistent with the findings and for those groups that had a disparity, and that those goals should reflect the availability. So on race-neutral remedies, The first thing we think that you need to consider is having a formal written procurement policy and procedures so that you can have uniformity across the departments, not just in how they record their data and their contracts, but how they make decisions about awards, advertising, management of contracts. There are many things that should be codified. You have it, as the council has approved it in their ordinances, but then how those ordinances are actually implemented should be formal in a written policies and procedures. And also that we think an owner-controlled insurance program is a progressive tool that's used around the nation. It saves you money because all the businesses that receive a contract on the professional service or construction side can use that owner-controlled insurance program, and so there's uniformity. It's advantageous to minorities and women who often are quoted much higher prices, and those are passed to you as well. So there's some things I think you can gain from looking at that as a new policy and a new program within the city. And then a policy to unbundle contracts. The multi-year contracts that are bundled are really denying businesses, regardless to race and gender, access to your contracting opportunities, because few vendors, as the data has shown, are in control of most of the city's dollars. And so unbundling, reducing the number of years in your contracts should make contracts more available, and then with policies and practices that give access to businesses, there should be more use, and you should be able to address your disparity. And also, bonding requirements need to be reassessed. Many governments, particularly municipal governments and counties, rethink how they apply their bond and their exposure that they are trying to protect themselves against with a bond. And on smaller contracts, they're just eliminating bonds, performance bonds in entirety. So it's something for you to look at. And where there are disputes, there should be, again, formal procedures. And if you had written policies and procedures incorporating within that standards for when there is a dispute between the prime and the sub, or dispute between the prime and the city. If you happen to have a good relationship and you're part of that little group of 70 that are getting 70% of the contracts, those disputes are not meaningful because you have a relationship with the department and you can get them resolved. But for the newcomer, the companies trying to enter with who's been excluded, you need formal processes to ensure that they get to participate and they don't lose money by being a city contractor. And then you must consider, I think, tracking and monitoring within your program, which means you have to staff the department, the division, a diversity and inclusion office to have sufficient personnel and to empower them to be able to make demands of the prime contractors, and non-compliance should be non-responsive. But that means that the office has to have the authority to do that, and we think that you should really consider that, and really think that you should reevaluate your pre-qualification requirements. You are, I think, in my experience, one in the nation that has anything as arduous as you have, and that requires primes and subs to be pre-qualified before they can submit a bid, and to ask about things that are so fundamental to the operation of the business and not really necessarily germane to a contract. Well, bonding might be required, but to have it in place, have insurance and other benefits just to submit a bid really limits the pool of people who can submit bids to you. So those are our recommendations, and we think there's some things that you want to consider for post-disparity study, and I don't know if you want to speak to that, Mrs. Brown, or not, but definitely you need an ordinance, and I think that sounds like you're on course to do that. Did you want to speak to these, or should I finish?
Sure. I'm happy to do so.
Okay.
So in terms of our next steps, we've talked a lot about how we begin to move these things forward. And obviously, as we begin to codify some of the changes that we think are appropriate to achieve parity in our contracting, we'll begin to look to council for your support in drafting of a new program and procurement ordinances that will support that parity. We'll also begin to obviously begin to staff up the Office of Diversity and Inclusion to not only begin to be responsive and supportive of our minority businesses with respect to the types of technical assistance and development assistance that's needed, but to also work with our departments and the prime contracting community around the accountability measures that need to be put into place to ensure that we are tracking along the goals of diversity and inclusion in our contracting. And then obviously, thirdly, I would also say that we would certainly want to be able to do this in a manner that is both cooperative and collaborative with the larger community as a whole. Many of you have probably heard me say many times that as we begin to move forward in this work, we don't do that in isolation, that we certainly need to be mindful of our prime contracting community and bringing them to the table as partners. I think there are a number of good examples where that has been successful, but also being able to work with our minority and women-owned business community around those things that we think are appropriate and that will be helpful to ensure that those who are impacted most by these decisions have the opportunity to be engaged. So when we begin to think about how we begin to do some of those things, one of the first opportunities will take place August 5th, where we will have two community meetings that allows us the opportunity to once again share some of this data, but begin to get the level of stakeholder input that we desire in order to advance some of these efforts forward. And we would certainly encourage that all stakeholders in our community come out and voice their opinions and concerns and be willing to work with us as we begin to move towards those next steps. And just lastly, we have forged a number of partnerships across the community in advance of the release of the disparity study, and we continue to do so just to be sure that as we are moving forward, that we bring the right level of resources and training and technical assistance support that's needed to move our initiatives forward. As you'll see there, a number of banks are at the table with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and have lended their support and expertise and their willingness to continue working with us around enhancing the capacity of our minority businesses, as well as the community advocacy organizations in our community as well, who work with those businesses as well and who can share with us their concerns and issues and help us to move in the right direction. So that completes the presentation that we had for you today, and we'd be happy to take any questions at this point.
Well, thank you, Director. Thank you, Dr. Ramsey, for your presentation, for the work that you've done, and the information that you have presented to us this evening. As we were sitting through the information, and it was a lot of information, it kind of reminded me how long we've been working at this. So long that I started this disparity study when I was chair of the committee several years ago, gave up the chairmanship, and reclaimed the chairmanship, and we are just, and we're here now. And so you spoke about data, and you gave the timeline for some pushbacks and some delays specific to data. You kind of told us about what happened. I guess my question is, why were there issues with the data? Where was the issues that would have account for us having to go back to the drawing board?
The issue arose when we submitted the draft report, and department heads in reading it felt that the numbers were not correct. The initial thought was that the numbers that the auditor provided were incorrect, that IT actually got very intimately involved with that and did an analysis of exactly what was extracted, what was presented to us, and what we presented back to the city. And all of the data that the auditor provided could be accounted for in the manner in which we handled the data. So that issue came off the table at some point. And then once that issue was off the table, then the question was, so what is it that may not be in the auditor's records? And that's when it was revealed that some federally funded contracts, which were done through loans from the federal government, particularly EPA is one area where federal government does loans, SRA loans, and that those loans did not enter into, or as they were put into the financial system, they were put in as loans and not contracts. And so the departments then had access in their own systems of those contracts and the value of those contracts. And so that was ultimately determined to be one source of data that was not in, and that was provided, and that accounted for the 0.5% of change in the actual number of dollars in the analysis. And then there was discussion about what had been classified into construction versus professional services or goods and services. It's never a very defined area, because what you call construction and what I may call construction is different. Fortunately, we have standards that we use to define what types of contracts would go in each category. So that helped to focus that discussion. And so there were some decisions made that some contracts would be reclassified, and so we did that. And then I think we came ultimately to a conclusion in early June of 2019 that the data was now complete. All contracts that they thought had been omitted either were determined not to have been omitted, or they were federally funded, and some were put back into the analysis.
Thank you. When I was, again, back when I was chair the first time of this committee, and when we put the RFP out for someone to do the disparity study, one of the things that stuck out to me about Mason Tillman was your long track record of having any challenges to your disparity studies around the country upheld. And so having that history, the data that you have now, do you feel confident, if challenged, will be upheld? It's funny, I keep this in my office. It's the 1996 Graham ruling in Columbus, the last time that we've had race-based programming. And so I'm extremely sensitive to challenges that may come that may challenge the work that we have all put so much time and effort into. Are you confident that the data that is presented would be upheld if challenged?
Yes, I am, and we're very sensitive to the nature of the challenges, both to the city's programs over the last decade or so, as well as across the nation. And thus, we were very, very mindful of the fact that the issue of the capacity of the businesses was important. And it's for that reason that we had made a decision some years ago now to do to remove outliers from our analysis. So we do not include in the prime analysis very large contracts. And additionally, at the subcontract level, which is the only level in which we're recommending race-based goals, we are confident that we did everything possible to reconstruct that data, and that we were very conscientious and thorough in identifying available businesses. So yes, I think that this project, a product and a program based on it, would be well supported by the data. Thank
you. You just brought up something else that I jotted down when you were speaking, that you had to go back and reconstruct the subcontracts. Mm-hmm. Is that acceptable for the city? Is that normal? That
standard.
It's standard. That folks don't.
It's standard.
That cities don't track their subcontracts.
They don't do a thorough job. They will often track minority and women, if that's, or small business, depending on the nature of their program. But in terms of tracking all subcontractors, that is, we have found to not be a standard in this country.
Okay. All right. And just the last question, for my clarity, one of the things that we look for is the significant statistical disparity. Is that something that is that a percentage? Is there an equation that speaks to that, or is that an anecdotal?
No, that is a standard that, and it's a statistically significant is a standard used in the decision of the court, and the statisticians have defined what constitutes statistical significance. So it is a statistical formula.
Thank you. I just want to encourage folks that if you would like to ask questions of, or make comments on the disparity study, make comments, that we certainly would encourage you to do so. Councilmember Favor, do you have any questions?
I don't really have more of a comment. Number one, I want to thank you for your the thoroughness of this report. I know that it has taken quite some time to get here, but I would appreciate a well-researched document that accurately represents where we are as a city right now than a rushed product. If we're going to right some wrongs, we need to have a firm foundation of where we're at. And so we have some work to do in the city of Columbus. And I might be new to council, but this is work that I'm excited to be a part of. And so I look forward to digging into the weeds of these documents. I'm an attorney by trade, and so all of this is just right up my alley. And so I look forward to working with Council President Hardin and the rest of the members of council, along with Director Brown, and developing a comprehensive plan to attack this, because we have too much talent in our city, our minority business owners, our women business owners, and I'll leave it at that. We've got work to do here. Thank you for your thoroughness.
I appreciate that.
Thank you, Councilmember. At the time, we have one speaker signed up, and that's Ms. J. Avery Frost. Would you like to come forward? Again, if you're interested in speaking,
Good evening.
good evening.
My name is J. Avery Frost, and I am Executive Director of the Central Ohio African American Chamber of Commerce. First, I would like to say thank you for the background on the report and for this convening. As an advocate and entrepreneur, I have been very interested to see statistically the environment in city contracting, or if the environment in city contract is as been perceived, opaque and difficult to navigate. Having a decade of experience in minority business development, I've seen the ebbs and flows of progression and regression in terms of ease of doing work with the city. I'm of the belief that the city must do more to proactively engage the small and minority business community. You must make the process to do business with you easier, less paperwork, a singular point of entry to see all opportunities, etc. Members report, you can be registered, certified, qualified, and actively bid, seeing a few positive results. The multiple vendor registration portals, the pre-qualification process, and more make the entire process cumbersome. It is unsurprising to hear vendors say they tried to and decided to invest their time in elsewhere. The mayor talks about making Columbus America's equal opportunity city. We hope that the release of this disparity study, or with the release, the city will take a good hard look at how it is culpable in the current state of affairs within its procurement practices. Multiple members of our chamber have noted that the swiftness of scheduling this hearing and the short notice of both this hearing and the data release demonstrates a troubling level of forethought on your behalf. With less than 24 hours to review this study in its entirety, any comments tonight are based on rush reviews. The short notice also accounts for the low turnout today. This is something that we've all been very interested in, and we had about 48 hours notice for this review, or for this session tonight. However, having reviewed the study in its entirety, the illumination of the procurement process shows how a lackadaisical approach to contracting can lead to outright exclusionary practices. The findings of this study indicate that there has been a disparity, and the city now has a legal obligation to remedy this. It states, given the Sixth Circuit's holding in Brunette versus City of Columbus, the factual predicate document in this study constitutes a significant factual predicate for the city to implement race and gender conscious remedies. We support the recommendations in their entirety. We would like to set We would like to just highlight a couple that we want to emphasize. Number one, set race and gender-specific subcontracting goals in construction and professional services. 2, create a business advisory council. 3, implement a one-step process for registration, certification, and pre-qualification. And 4, though not mentioned today, implement a sheltered market program. We are of the mind that based on the findings and the documented capacity of our businesses, that the city there should be little hesitation in implementing aggressive policies to address the disparities found. We look forward to being a resource and a partner in this process, but we also remain critical and paying attention to what's going on. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Frost. Can I just, how was your engagement over the time period of the study?
So our chamber launched in January 2018. So that was after the initial study had been done. So while we do have businesses that probably were part of the anecdotal, I can't speak specifically on that.
Okay. Have you been reached out to by the Department of Diversity and Inclusion or Mason Tillman at all as the Black Chamber, as the African American Chamber?
Just to let us know about updates coming about the pending release and of utilization, but that's about it.
Okay, thank you. I have another question. This question is for Director Demita Brown. So the city is also in the middle of a study of the small business ecosystem. That work is being really driven heavily out of the development department. We now have some first step recommendations from the disparity study driven out of your office on diversity and inclusion. How are we working to make sure that these two inflection points in our focus on small minority businesses are brought together, that we're having some type of a uniform conversation that will produce a strategy going forward?
Sure, sure. Thank you, Council President Harden. Certainly, Director Shoney and his team should be commended for the work that's being done under that small business assessment. I think what it does for us as a community is really helps us to, coupled with the disparity study findings, help us to really understand the environment in which we are expecting minority and women-owned businesses to participate in and ultimately be successful. And what it also does for us is helps us to understand what is the appropriate role for the City of Columbus to play in alleviating some of the barriers that we see with minority-owned businesses. And so we are working very closely with the Department of Development to understand those strategies, to understand what the appropriate role is for diversity and inclusion, what the role is for the Department of Development, and how we engage the right partners in the right capacity in order to address those things.
Thank you. One of the recommendations that Mason Tillman gives is about staffing in your department. It would be an omission not to speak to your staff level now and to not ask about your plans for getting this office back to full capacity. What is your staff now, and what is the plan to restaff this department?
Sure. Thank you, Council President Harden. Currently, the staffing is at a total of 4, with an authorized strength or an authorization for full-time employees of 11. We are currently in the process of hiring 3 business development specialists whose role is primarily to do 2 primary things: to work with the departments around their needs relative to their contracting and how we better engage minority and women-owned businesses in those processes, and then to also work with the minority and women-owned business community to understand their development and training and technical assistance needs. In addition to those business development specialists, we are also recruiting a supply diversity manager. In fact, those interviews are taking place next week, who will oversee all of those activities to ensure that as we implement the disparity study, that those things are properly managed and resourced to support that. Moving forward, during our 2020 budget expansion, we are asking for an expansion of at least 2 additional staff. One will be around our data and helping, helping us to manage all of the data that the office receives, both from a supply diversity perspective in our contracting, but also from a workforce diversity perspective as well. And the other piece, the other expansion request will include a position for a compliance officer who helps us to manage the accountability measures that will go along with the implementation of a program.
Thank you, Director. Going to next steps, you spoke about next steps, and of course we have to do the acceptance of this disparity study. But and you talked a little bit about the community engagement. One, would you hit back on the community engagement aspects of the fully vetting of this information and how we intend to disseminate this throughout the community? But secondly, when will the next time we will be engaged as council, or and maybe you can even speak to why we're having this hearing today versus after fall break?
Sure. So the next steps will include the work with the departments and the community around defining those recommendations and making them relevant for the city of Columbus and its impact on our minority business community. So we will spend the next few months engaged in that work. We would expect to come back to council before the year is out, I would anticipate, to come back to council with some recommendations for ordinance changes and the adoption of a program that would support a race and gender conscious, as well as race and gender neutral remedies moving forward.
Do you intend to work with the contractor to help you come up with those ordinance changes?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. That is engaged. We currently are in the process of defining the scope and the budget for that. There could be a potential that we would come back to council with and ask for additional dollars to complete that work, but Mason Tillman will certainly be involved in that process.
Thank you. Well, so I'll say, I think there was the reason why I wanted to have this hearing and have it today, one is because we're ending our legislative session on Monday, the last meeting, until September. There's important work that needs to happen between now and then. Having conversations with the Department of Diversity and Inclusion, knowing that there is going to be a lot of work that needs to happen next. What I stated to the department was that before the department comes back to council to engage in more resources for the next steps, that the community deserve to hear from about the disparity study. So that is why we are here today, and that's why we didn't wait till after the hearing or after the break to have this conversation. We have to accept the study as it stands at the last meeting, which will be on Monday, which we will do, which we will bring before council. But I wanted to make sure that we had an open and honest conversation as a community about what the data says, and look forward to moving forward together. This is maybe one of the most impactful things I think the city has done in a long time. It is a really big deal. It is extremely important to a lot of people, a lot of folks that look like me, a lot of folks that come from community that I've come from. It's almost personal. My grandmother was a former EBO director and did this work for the city of Columbus. And we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to make sure that our dollar spend represents the diversity of our city. And I take this role extremely serious, and our responsibility as council to provide the appropriate oversight of the administration and encouraging that we move forward and do better. I've, from the first day of Mayor Ginther's administration, appreciated him stepping forward and moving forward with the disparity study. It was something that we spoke about in 2015 before he became mayor, and he stepped up to the plate, and so I'm very grateful. This committee will be very engaged over the next several months and through the implementation months and really over the next year, really. We look forward to working closer with Mason Tillman. We look forward to taking these conversations outside of City Hall and making sure that the appropriate connections are being made with the minority and small business communities in Columbus. One question I just remembered, folks, folks have asked from the LGBTQ community about why folks aren't tracked and if there are disparities there. I thought, is there a reason why we do or don't track LGBTQ members?
Is it in terms of a disparity
In terms of
study?
disparity.
Well, the disparities, the court has only spoken to race. It didn't speak to gender at all. And so the need to have a statistically significant disparity to go forward with a minority business program is driven by the court. In terms of program that benefits veterans or any other community, it is a matter of looking at the pattern of use. And you can do that by taking the availability data set that we have created and going back to that data set to determine what the composition is for any other group that you might want to include in your program.
Thank you so much. I'd have never missed if I didn't ask that question. Again, thank you so much, Director. We look forward to bringing forward this ordinance on Monday for consideration for accepting the results of the disparity study, and then looking forward to being a partner with your office and with the mayor and with Mason Tillman moving forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you.